So we ended last week talking about how plants and fungi started to establish themselves on land, and they started to conquer that new environment, right? Now we're going to explore how plants started to expand through the rest of the terrestrial environment, right? So we started out, early plants started out in that area right next to water, right next to where we think the ocean may have been coming in. So how do plants now move away from that source of water? And what types of environments and what types of adaptations do they have that help them to survive in this new terrestrial environment? Because remember, besides that ring right by where the water was hitting the land, the rest of that environment, the rest of that land was basically just rock, basically just empty, right? So how do plants continue to expand and take over the world? That's kind of our theme for this week. So this is an artist's depiction of what early Earth during this time period, maybe about 500 million years ago, 450 million years ago, would have looked like. Some very early plants. These would have been very low to the ground. Okay, so if you see the scale, these would have been maybe 10 centimeters tall, right? These are supposed to be fungi. We have some fossil evidence of some giant fungi that ruled the world at this point in time too. So, but how do plants start to take over drier environments further away from water, where there's not necessarily a reliable source of water year-round? Okay. I'll post another video that walks through this phylogeny and the main questions that we ask to determine where plants fall in this phylogeny, what characteristics they have. Okay. But we are going to focus here on this group here today, the non-vascular plants, also sometimes called the bryophytes, though I don't like that term because there is a group in here that is Bryophyta, but not all of these are bryophytes, if that makes sense. So bryophytes is not a true taxonomic term, it's just kind of a generic term that we used to talk about plants that are non-vascular. Non-vascular meaning they don't have vascular tissue. So they diverged, these groups, these non-vascular plants diverged relatively early on in the phylogeny of plants. And we have three groups, hornworts, mosses, and liverworts. And we talk about them all collectively as being non-vascular plants. So we think that this group, it's kind of like the outgroup in a sense. We think it retains a lot of characteristics of the ancestor of embryophytes. One of those characteristics being that their dominant life cycle stage in these non-vascular plants is the gametophyte stage. Remember, gametophyte is the haploid stage, right? So what we mean by that is when we look at a moss, like the mosses that you've been collecting, most of what you're seeing in the longer-lived life cycle stage of that plant is gametophyte. So all of this tissue in here, all the stuff that makes up most of the organism of that plant, most of the body of that plant, that's all haploid tissue. That is all gametophyte tissue. I'll post another video walking through the life cycle of these plants. We won't talk about that here, but the idea here is that this is gametophyte. Remember, gametophyte makes gametes. The sporophyte forms after a sperm fertilizes an egg, and the sporophyte is this structure right here in mosses. It usually sticks up and out, it grows up and out of the female gametophyte. So the sporophyte will grow up and out of the female gametophyte. Sporophyte is, remember, diploid, twin. This is where we get meiosis to produce those haploid spores, which then continue the life cycle. Right? So this tissue right here, the sporophyte tissue, is not the main dominant life cycle stage. This is only around for certain periods of time after reproduction has occurred, after the gametes have fused. Okay, so non-vascular plants are gametophyte dominant in their life cycle stage. They also don't use seeds to reproduce, right? We don't have seeds yet, okay? All right, so no seeds in mosses. We'll talk about seeds later because they're a huge evolutionary innovation, but we do have spores. Okay, so remember, spores are just that haploid single cell that will go through mitosis to produce the gametophyte generation. So here's what I kind of wanted to show you what some of these spores look like. So this is at 1500 times magnification, and this is a spore that's starting to germinate. So it's going to start to go through the process of mitosis, expand itself out, and we call that process of growing out. It creates the protonema, and that's how the moss life cycle starts. And then the whole thing starts over again, right? So spore germinates, moss spores, single haploid cell germinates in protonema. Protonema goes through mitosis until it creates the gametophyte stage, and then the gametes fuse. Okay, mosses. Remember, they're gametophyte dominant. When I say mosses, I mean non-vascular plants, okay? Their gametes swim, okay? Not that unusual in the world to have swimming gametes, right? A lot of animals have swimming gametes. But if you're a plant and you can't get up and walk around and find your other mate and you're living on land, swimming gametes not necessarily the most effective method of reproduction, right? In order to swim, what do you need? You need water, right? So that gives us a clue as to the type of environments that these plants can live in. Because their gametes swim, they can only reproduce in areas where water is around for a decent part of the year, at least for part of the year that they can reproduce, right? So this is some drawings of some common gametes that swim. These are mosses, liverworts. This is a diatom, right? Just for an example. These are all seedless vascular plants, but same idea here. They have flagella and they're going to swim. It's kind of what they look like. They kind of go on like little curlicues. Pretty weird. Okay, so swimming gametes. What does that tell us about the types of environments that they have to be in order to reproduce, right? So they're limited in the types of environments in which they can live in because they need water to reproduce. So they can't necessarily live very effectively in really, really dry environments or where water is not readily available for the gametes to swim in. They also don't have any vascular tissue, okay? In the gametophyte stage, there is no vascular tissue. So by vascular tissue, we mean transport tubes around the body of the plant that let the plant move water and nutrients to different portions of the body, okay? So, how do they get their water? How does water into their cells? They don't have roots. They have rhizoids like this on this liverwort right here that they can use to attach themselves to a substrate, but those aren't roots. True roots are used for uptake of water and minerals from the soil. Those are not roots. Those are just for attachment. And then the leaves of a non-vascular plant, look how thin they are under the microscope. Right? They're just a couple cells thick. So how do they get water? Right? They're just going to absorb water from their environment. Okay? So some liverworts will have a cuticle, but generally most non-vascular plants do not have a cuticle because they're relying on absorbing water from the environment in order to keep their cells hydrated. Okay? But they do have adaptations to live in drier environments where water is not around all the time. Okay? So, like here's some moss rehydrating. Okay, so kind of like we did. We dried out our moss, we rehydrated it. Moss can be dehydrated for decades and kind of go into this dormant state and then just absorb any water that's there, rehydrate, and come back to life. Okay? So they don't have any cuticles. Some liverworts do, but generally non-vascular plants do not have cuticles, so that way they can absorb water from the environment because they don't have roots that allow them to pull water up from the soil and transport it to the rest of their body. Okay, so they don't have cuticles. Do you think they have stomata? There's no need for stomata. Stomata are there to allow for a gap, a space in that cuticle for gas exchange to happen. It's not an issue here. Okay, so they generally don't have cuticles or stomata. Okay, so we have three major groups of non-vascular plants. The first being the quote-unquote Bryophyta, the true mosses. This is mostly what we've been seeing as we've been collecting mosses. They, like we just saw, do not have a cuticle. They don't have any stomata. They have the ability to dehydrate and rehydrate very quickly. They're also gametophyte dominant, just like all the other members of the non-vascular plant group. There's some unique characteristics about mosses. Usually, in some species, they have what's called a pygmy male situation going on. So mosses, bryophytes, will have one individual will produce male gametes, another individual will produce female gametes, okay? But they have to be in close proximity to each other, so that way the sperm can swim to the egg, right? The egg remains inside of that female gametophyte. Some mosses do this thing where the females will send out certain compounds to minimize the growth of any males that are around, to keep them small, to keep them pygmy-sized. So that way they're only big enough really just to produce gametes. And then those gametes are sent off to the female, and then the female can reproduce, send out that sporophyte and the spores in the next generation. So they keep any males that are nearby small, so they can basically outcompete the males and only keep them around for their gametes. Bryophytes also have this unique characteristic of being able to cause the soil to become very acidic. Okay, peat moss bogs are a thing. So this helps them decreasing the acidity, increasing the hydrogen ion concentration. It helps them to outcompete other organisms that are in that area, right? But it also has some unique characteristics. There are a lot of interesting archaeological finds that have been dug up from peat moss bogs because in a low acidity environment, there's not a lot of decomposition. And so bodies and things will mummify. We've found some bodies from like 2,000, 3,000 years ago that are in really, really good condition. Their hair is still there, right? So, yeah, just a kind of an interesting little side note about these mosses. Here we have the Hepatophyta, previously known as Hepatophyta. Now we call it Marcantiophyta. These are the Liverworts. They get that name because they kind of have three lobes like a liver. Again, what we're looking at here is mostly the Gametophyte stage. Okay, some of these groups do have cuticles. We do have some here. Okay, if you look in the right places, you'll be able to find some liverworts. But they will also send up their sporophyte generation, and then they additionally have these little cups right here that they use for asexual reproduction. So these basically create little like protonema that they can send out, okay, for asexual reproduction, but they can do sexual reproduction as well. Create those gametes, create the sporophyte, and then produce the spores. So the last major group of these non-vascular plants, the Anthocerotophyta Hornworts. So antho basically means antler, right? So these get their name by the unique sporophyte structure that they create. So these little kind of green sticks coming out, that's their diploid sporophyte generation, where we find their sporangium where their spores are produced, right? These little guys are super cool. They actually have this unique ability to concentrate carbon dioxide in their cells. We only see this in algae. This is the only other types of organisms that can do this are algae. But they can use specific enzymes and specific pathways to concentrate carbon dioxide in their cells to make photosynthesis more efficient. They still use the same enzyme for photosynthesis for capturing carbon that other photoautotrophs use, but they can concentrate the carbon dioxide in their cells, which is unique and interesting and really, really cool. It's also kind of weird they can do that, but yet they only have one chloroplast per cell, which is bizarre. You're much more efficient to have multiple chloroplasts, right? But they only have one chloroplast per cell, usually. Okay. They also have this weird kind of deal with cyanobacteria, where any parts of the plant that die, kind of cyanobacteria will colonize that area, and cyanobacteria are helpful because they can help fix nitrogen as well, right? So most of what we see here is a combination of both the hornwort, cyanobacteria, kind of making up the more gooey parts, and then the sporophyte generation right there. Okay, but big idea with these ones, yeah, they're living on land. Yeah, their rhizoids will have fungal symbionts, but they are restricted in the environments in which they can exist. We typically only find non-vascular plants in areas where there's plenty of water, so that their swimming gametes can find the egg. Okay. So we're going to take another look at some of the other groups of plants and the adaptations that they have that let them live in other areas, maybe a little bit further away from water.